Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, back. Can you hear me? Success? Hello? This is working? Yeah? Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Both those of you who are here in real life and the mysterious online live stream followers, of whom there are no doubt many thousands. As Chair of Compassion in Dying, I am really pleased to be welcoming you to this event and also not doing any further speaking. But it's great to have a group of such interesting people here. And my briefing note said that I was to encourage you all that there should be a lively debate. And I think given the conversations that have already happened in the first few minutes of everyone sitting down, there's not going to be any need for encouragement on that front. Compassion in Dying has supported 25,000 people to plan for the end of life, and that has taken place through a range of information services and outreach projects that the charity has undertaken. And in the next hour and a half, we're going to share with you everything we've learned from those 25,000 people. Importantly, we're going to share with you our vision for the changes in culture and practice that are actually needed for there to be real change and real person-centred care delivered. Now, you are all familiar with this area. You probably know a lot about the many reports that have been written. It's always easy to define what the problems are and much harder to actually do things that really make change happen. And that's why I am very honoured to be a trustee of Compassion in Dying, because there is a real, genuine commitment not just to complaining about the problems and pointing them out, but actually doing something about them. So we've got lots of interesting speakers, a room full of interesting people. It should be a really interesting afternoon. I have some boring information for you as well about housekeeping, but I do like doing this. There's no fire alarm planned. If there is a fire alarm, please leave the building by the nearest exit. Go out and find your way to the UCL main quadrangle on Gower Street. If anyone needs assistance exiting the building, there are plenty of Compassion in Dying staff around who'll be able to give you a hand. You may have noticed that we are photographing the event. If you don't want to be photographed, you need to make yourself known to the man in the pink shirt, and he will make sure that there are no photos of you. So if you're having a particularly bad hair day, let him know. We are also live streaming the event on Twitter. If you are on Twitter, hashtag I wish I had known, then please do tweet away. If you're not on Twitter, you should be on Twitter. It's really cool. And the password and everything for logging into the Wi-Fi here, you need to choose welcome, but once you've done that, those instructions will get you through onto the Wi-Fi. And you've got delegate packs, which have got various things in them. The I Wish I Had Known publication, just a new publication from Compassion in Dying. You've got a copy of What Now? Questions to ask after a terminal diagnosis, which we published fairly recently, and you'll hear a bit more later on today about the digital work that we're doing to complement that paper booklet. You'll also hear about something which I feel particularly strongly about, which is our decision to open source our materials and to really put our money where our mouth is and make sure that we are doing absolutely everything we can to make sure that our extremely good and award-winning publications are available to everyone and not just to keep them to ourselves and to as many organisations do, with a sort of fear that by sharing things openly and without your logo stamped all over them, you're going to somehow undermine yourselves. You know, we've taken what I think is a really important and significant decision to take the opposite view and say that what we're about is trying to fix these problems in the real world, and the more we can do that by sharing and by not being proprietary about what we're doing, the better that's going to be. So you'll hear more about that as well. There will be a few talks you can see from your programme from staff and trustees of Compassion in Dying. Then we have a really interesting panel of people. Do get involved in the discussion, ask questions, join in, and have a really interesting afternoon. That is all from me, and I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, who is Dame Barbara Munro, who is a fellow trustee of Compassion in Dying, and unlike me, an expert in palliative care. And she is going to share Compassion's vision and introduce our new publication to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here today and also to catch up with so many old friends. I'm not quite sure about the expert epithet, however. I was thinking that this is a really interesting time for charities. And if we looked at last week's Civil Society Futures inquiry, it was quite outspoken in its findings. I quote, "Too often in civil society, short-term impact measures are seen as the best measures of success." And the inquiry also stated, "We've heard loud and clear that real long-lasting success comes from the depth and breadth of connections with people and communities, and the opportunity for everyone to have power." These findings resonated with us. Compassion in Dying recognises the need for a large-scale culture change around death and dying. We're working towards end-of-life becoming a really person-centred kind of care, not just measured by proxies like place of death, but really focused on understanding each individual and delivering treatment and care which is based on their priorities and their values. When we listen to the people we support, they often tell us that end-of-life care conversations are too dominated by clinical issues with insufficient attention paid to social and emotional issues, which sometimes people struggle with the most. The Civil Society inquiry talked about true success coming from everyone having power. Of course, it wasn't talking specifically about dying people, but we believe that moving towards person-led decision-making with the power sharing that implies is an essential part of people getting the end-of-life care experience that they want in ways that matter to them. We want people to be able to talk openly about their wishes for the end of life, including their goals, priorities and preferences for care, to make informed choices and have the opportunity to discuss those choices with healthcare professionals to understand the likely outcomes of decisions about treatment. And we want them to be able to plan their care and record and share their choices. And lots of evidence shows that if you do that, your choices are more likely to be met. The recent inquiry also stresses the importance of connections with people and communities. And I like to think that in this room here, we are a community of people engaged and very connected in different ways with trying to improve end-of-life care and person-centred care in particular. And we're looking forward to hearing from you all in our panel discussion. Today, we're launching our new I Wish I Had Known report, and there's a copy in your delegate pack. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. There's lots of amazing work being done, much, if not most of it, by organisations represented in this room. But we do think the voice and experiences of dying people themselves needs to be central to this effort. And that's why we're offering you the experiences and the insights that we've gathered from the 25,000 people we have so far supported to make decisions. I want to highlight very briefly three things. We need to really act upon our recognition of the value about information and honest conversations. We hear from the people we support that having honest information is a powerful way of changing the culture of death and dying and of reducing misconceptions and fears. The problem is that people find it very hard to get the information they need when they want it. One of the people featured in our report said, "I wasn't prepared for how quickly my husband went downhill. I think if someone had told him earlier about what may happen, we might have been more prepared to ask about what choices he had for his care." The report reflects the research we undertook with 600 dying people and their carers. A third of the dying people we spoke to said they hadn't been given enough information about the options available to them, and half of the bereaved carers agreed. There are people we've spoken to whose doctors have been unwilling to talk to them about treatment options, about the side effects of treatment, or about stopping treatment and its pros and cons. And we've heard that this has led to unwanted treatment and lots of distress. Some of our narratives are about denial from patients and families, but if we're honest, we need to recognise that equally as relevant, if not more so, is the reluctance of many healthcare professionals to initiate these conversations. And the barriers to communication that leads to really get in the way of people being able to make informed decisions. The second issue is avoiding the temptation of easy fixes. It's great that the move towards person-centred care has taken hold in the way that it has. But place of death has very quickly become accepted as an indicator about whether end-of-life care is meeting or failing to meet people's wishes at the end of life. And a common understanding has developed that shifting hospital deaths to home would be a marker of success. Yet the data on where people want to die, I would suggest, is in need of much greater scrutiny. A home death isn't necessarily a good death, and we know that a good death in those circumstances is very dependent on the extent and quality of the support available. What's more, we know that place of death is a relatively low priority for many people who more often prioritise pain relief and retaining dignity. So I think we need to shift away from what can be a distracting focus on place of death and really think about how we can enable people to make informed decisions. The third thing is that we need to challenge the idea that death is a taboo. I've been in the business for a long time and I can't remember how many events and articles I've read and been to where this has been the theme. I'm not sure that this is true. It's true that these kinds of conversations can be difficult and challenging, but labelling them as taboo seems to be counterproductive. The YouGov polling that we commissioned earlier this year found that only 14% of people would feel uncomfortable having a conversation about their end-of-life care with a healthcare professional. Yet only 52% of them would instigate that conversation themselves. And broadly speaking, those kind of findings are replicated in other studies. So I think it's important for us to shift our focus away from death and dying being a taboo, from the idea that people don't want to talk about death and dying. I think we need to be aware as healthcare professionals and as people working in charities that people do want to talk about death and dying. It's just that they often don't know when and how to start that conversation. So those are just some introductory remarks, and I'm now going to ask Natalie, who works for Compassion in Dying, to come and tell us some more about this piece of work that we've undertaken. Thank you, Natalie.
I wish I had known is the core theme of this afternoon's event, precisely because we heard it time and time again with the research that we did last year. So as Barbara's mentioned, last year we spoke to 600 dying people and carers. And we did this because we wanted to understand what the end of life was like for them. What worked well? What didn't work well? Where was the confusion? And crucially, where were the gaps in the support that people were able to receive that we thought ourselves as an organisation might be able to fill? The people we spoke to described feeling lost. They described facing into the gulf of unknown when being told that they had a life-changing diagnosis. And they told us that they didn't know how to get the information they needed to ask the questions to make the decisions that were right for them as individuals. Now this puzzled us, if we're honest, because we knew that there's a whole wealth of information out there. Lots of it is generated and shared by the organisations that are represented in this room this afternoon. So we set about to understand more about the problem, and ultimately we wanted to help try to solve the problem. So in addition to the 600 people that we'd already spoken to, we spoke to 24 more people, and we had in-depth interviews, and I'm really pleased to see some of the people that contributed to those interviews in the room this afternoon. So we spoke to more dying people, we spoke to carers, we spoke to people living with life-changing diagnosis, to healthcare professionals, to policymakers, and we asked them the same questions, and we spent about an hour and a half with each person. And what we discovered that there were several consistent and distinct elements to not be able to access the information. So people talked about making treatment decisions. Sometimes they weren't aware that there were decisions that were being made about their treatment, let alone being involved in making those decisions. So they were things like the potential side effects of one treatment, or the potential impact on quality of life of choosing one potential treatment over another, or even ending treatment. People told us they didn't understand their prognosis. They could tell us what the condition was that they had, but they didn't necessarily therefore know whether it was terminal, what the expected progression might be. They told us they couldn't find the practical support that they needed, and sometimes this had absolutely devastating consequences. So for instance, having to stay in hospital or a care home rather than coming home to be with their family, which is where they would have chosen. And they told us that they couldn't find the emotional and the social support that sometimes were the things that they needed most of all. So working with digital agency Unboxed, we used what's called sprint methodology to set about developing a prototype which aimed to link people to the information they were telling us that they couldn't find. So over 5 days, in collaboration with some of the people that had taken part in the interviews, so with dying people, carers and health and care professionals, we set about building a prototype. And you can see on this slide some of the initial sketches that were used in the development process. So throughout the interviews, we heard really strongly that people just didn't know where to start. So we tried to build in a solution to that. There were free text boxes at the top that people could type in any question they wanted and would take them to the relevant aspect of information. And we also designed the information around a journey, for want of a better word, of what people might expect after diagnosis of a life-changing illness. So this is the prototype that we developed. It's a website, and it guides people using a series of questions. And if you click on any of these questions, it takes you through to a series of web pages which both share original content that we created, but they also link you in to a whole range of information that's out there. And the information is information that we feel is high quality and appropriate for people to be using. We'll have the prototype set up next door after the event, so if you want to have a look through and give it a test, please do. There's an iPad that you'll be able to have a look at. So what did people think of it? They really liked the questions. They thought that was really helpful, and they identified that the questions helped them think through the things that they didn't even know that they didn't know. They really liked the aspects of shared experience that we built in throughout. So there are quotes from the people that we interviewed, and you'll see more of the quotes around the room today. And there are signposts from people living with life-changing diagnosis throughout the website. And they told us that they also really liked the simplicity of it. It felt usable and it felt approachable and friendly. But they told us that this wasn't enough. People described feeling alone, feeling stressed, and sometimes even feeling guilty that they weren't able to cope in the face of life-changing diagnosis. They told us they just wanted to have a conversation, and they wanted to speak to somebody that had been through something similar to them, that they felt that they could be honest with and ask all the daft questions or be guided through and help to think about how to make the right decisions for them. And this was a really consistent piece of feedback, both from people themselves living with life-changing diagnosis and also those caring for them. So we're working towards developing a new service. We want to develop a peer navigator service, and this will be 2 new members of staff that are employed to work on our information line, and there'll be people that are able to share their own lived experience, either of living with life-changing illness or of caring for somebody who does. And the idea is that they'll be able to walk alongside the person they're supporting on the phone. That person can have multiple conversations if they would like to. the peer navigator can signpost them to local services or to great information, and they can really help them think through what questions do you want to ask, what matters to you, and how can you get the information that will let you make the right decisions for you. So we know that peer support can make a really dramatic difference to the people that benefit from it. And we've got colleagues working in HIV and mental health to thank for really pioneering this approach. And it's now widespread across the charity sector. Lots and lots of people are able to benefit from peer support. So neither peer support nor navigation in themselves are new. But less is known about their use in combination, and there's not a great deal that's known about their use supporting people living with life-changing illness and at the end of life. So as well as supporting the people that use our charity services and that we're accountable to, we also want to contribute to the building of an evidence base in this area, and that will be one of our contributions to the broader sector. And I thank you, I suppose, for the time and enthusiasm that people have contributed to the research and to helping us get to this place. So by developing a peer navigation service, ultimately we hope that people like Molly, who you can see here, Molly lives with incurable cancer and she was one of the participants in our research. We hope that people like Molly can find the emotional and practical support that they told us they so desperately needed. And we aim to help people like Molly move beyond just coping towards a life and a death rooted in what matters to them as an individual.
Thank you, Natalie. And I think Natalie has expressed very powerfully some of the things that we've discovered as a result of doing this work and our thinking about peer navigation. I'm going to ask Dave now to come up and talk to us about tools.
Thank you, Barbara. Open sourcing. It's a new initiative for us that we've been trialling throughout the year, and it's a bit of a different piece of work to what we would normally do. So I normally work on our digital projects. So I'm used to sort of building things, creating things, working with our service users to augment our existing services to better meet their needs. But this is a bit different from that. The open source project is more about removing things and relinquishing control and giving up ownership of some of the things that we've developed. So this is, in essence, what we're doing. We're giving others permission to use our resources via a Creative Commons license to change the branding on any of our materials so that they don't no longer our materials, they're their materials. So the words would remain the same, but the logo, the colours, anything that would need to change to make it fit into another setting could be changed. I'll talk a little bit more about what we've been doing during this pilot later, but more important than what we've done is why we've done it. So why would a charity in effect give away its resources that it spent so much time and effort developing? Well, there are a few core reasons that allowed us to do this and that got the board to agree to it. So one is to help others, other charities, other service providers, so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel or duplicate work simply because they need a resource to be theirs. You know, end of life might be a small part of their work, but it's an area where we focus on tremendously, so why not help them by just sort of giving them what we've done and letting them put their logo on it. The others is around responding to some of the feedback we got from some of the communities we were working with. So we worked with a whole variety of different people in different community settings, from Somali women to Portuguese-speaking people. And those communities were more than happy to engage with our services, to start making an advanced statement, to think about their priorities, their spiritual needs, to think about what they might want at the end of life. But they were really quite put off by the word dying. So just remove it. There's no need for our logo to be on there if it's a barrier. If it's a barrier, then it doesn't need to be there. And that's really why we did this, is to remove any barriers that we could find. So if there's a barrier around our branding, or if it would work better in an existing setting without our branding, then just take it off. So for example, in some areas, they've got local initiatives that have got their own brands that local clinicians and local service users identify. So why not integrate it into that system? Because it will become part of what's already going on in that area, and it makes it easier for those people to start those conversations if they feel like it's their resource and that they own it. So essentially for us, it's about delivering on our charitable purpose, to get more people to plan for the end of their life. It's more important that people do that than for us to be seen to be helping them. So it's about mission focus, it's about getting our core purpose done as quickly and efficiently as possible. So today marks the beginning of us starting to roll out our open source project and making it more widely available. But we have been taking it a little bit slowly to start off with while we figured out how well it would work. So we chose a relatively restricted Creative Commons license. So under the license we used, you can't adapt the work without our permission, and you can't use it for commercial purposes. The reason we chose to not let people adapt it is really about a bit of a safeguard. For example, an advanced decision to refuse treatment has to be witnessed properly, and it has to have certain wording in there for it to be valid and applicable. So we wouldn't want anyone to accidentally change that and it not to work in practice. That said, we will adapt it, but it needs to be sort of done in collaboration so that we can make sure that it will work effectively from our point of view and in the setting it needs to work in. And we limited it to not everything that we're doing, but a few fact sheets and a few publications that are some of our most used publications. And we limited it to printed materials in the first instance, simply so that we could test the principle of whether this would work quickly and simply and without spending too much money. When something's new, we didn't want to waste money, which is hard to come by these days, on an initiative that might not work. We wanted to test it out properly first. So this is an example from Jersey. Jersey recently enacted Mental Capacity Act type legislation, very similar to the one we already have here. And they wanted to recommend to the citizens of Jersey an advanced decision to refuse treatment form that they were happy with. And largely, ours was perfect for them, except for a few differences in the legislation. So, for example, those rights in Jersey kick in at the age of 16, whereas in England and Wales it's 18. So they needed to collaborate with us to make it work in their setting, and they did. And this is their form, which is almost completely based on our language, but just rebranded and changed for the locale of Jersey. And we've trialled it in quite a few other settings as well. So GPs are using it, some hospices, and in lots and lots of different community organisations. And so we've got a sense now that this works, and we're thinking about how we can roll it out and really how this will work in the future. And the future really depends on different communities around the country. This isn't about sort of shoehorning our content into every possible setting. It's about making it as accessible as possible to a wider variety of people as possible. So the main benefit for us, for Compassion in Dying, is reaching new audiences, albeit sometimes indirectly, but like in Jersey, new opportunities to collaborate with new people. And one area we're very keen to perhaps explore would be condition-specific resources, because a lot of our resources are for end of life across the board. They're not necessarily catered for specific conditions. So there might be someone in this room right now who's exploring very similar issues to the things that we're talking about, but also has lots of condition-specific information that could be sort of augmented into our materials, adapted, and meet some very specific needs that they're aware of and that we're not. So we'd be very happy to explore those kind of opportunities with anyone here or not here for that matter. So the future of our open sourcing depends on you, really, and the needs of communities around the country. So no matter what form that takes, Compassion in Dying remains committed to removing any barriers when we see them, and to use open sourcing to help as many people as possible. And we'd be delighted to discuss with you here, or perhaps at another time, any ways that we can make that happen as quickly and efficiently as possible. Thank you.
Actually, Dave, if you and Nat both like to come back, because I think we've got a while for a few questions. So anybody have a question? This was actually a really exciting thing as a member of a board, and I sit on a few boards now, to make the decision around open sourcing. And like Tor, I feel profoundly that this is the right thing to do. And Dave said, we don't want to shoehorn it into everything. Actually, secretly, I'd like to shoehorn it into everything. Because, I've been around for a long time, and I'd just like to get this as far downstream as possible. That way we reduce the burden on everyone. And that burden is multifaceted and enormous. So, questions for Dave and Nat? Yeah, lovely.
My name is Jonathan Ramey. I'm a minister of religion, so speaking very much as someone who's sort of right at the coalface of life and death. And firstly, just to endorse that word empower, because perhaps the most common scenario I encounter, and most of my colleagues, is somebody comes back, I visit them, they've been to the hospital, and I say, so what did the doctor say, or consultant, and they either reply, can't remember, couldn't take it in, or didn't know what to ask. And of course, these are people who are really very savvy, very expert in whatever they want to know, whether it's car insurance or what smartphone to have, and yet they are totally helpless when it comes to their mortality. So firstly, to endorse that word empower, but secondly, to ask, which is, you mentioned you're doing a lot of work collaborative, which is great, with other care groups, and I noticed that Marie Curie and Macmillan are here. What about with the religious organisations, both those in the field, and also maybe ministerial training colleges, and what, if you have been doing that, what response have you been getting?
It's a good question. It's not something that we have done, and specifically as you've described, Jonathan. But probably the most interesting learning that we're getting at the moment in terms of the impact of religion on decision making is through our community outreach work. So we've previously done some work which, thank you, is that better? I'll just shout in the meantime. So we've previously done some work with Somali communities and South Asian communities, both of whom are predominantly Muslim, and we're currently doing some work with Portuguese-speaking people in Lambeth, most of whom are Catholic. Verena is standing at the back in the pink scarf, who leads this work. So if you're interested in finding out more, please do say hi to Verena. But one of the things in particular that we found from the Portuguese speakers is that they just don't like the word death. And they really, and I don't necessarily think this is part of their religious beliefs, but it's certainly a cultural aspect to their understanding. That they tell us very strongly that even just talking about the end of life, they really worry will bring about the end of life. So we're not working in the way that you've just described, Jonathan, but what we are doing is working through trusted community partners that have really great links in to different cultural and religious communities, kind of doing a ground-up approach in that way. But if you have ideas about particular partners, I'd be really happy to have a conversation with you afterwards.
Does anybody in the room have anything they want to add to that thread? Any other questions? It doesn't have to be a question, it could be a comment. Yes.
So, hi, I'm Sarah Russell. I'm a palliative care nurse who does a bit of research and education and a carer. I've got a question for both of you, actually. Natalie, the peer navigators, which I think are really interesting ideas. So I'm not asking this as an offensive question, I'm asking this out of curiosity. How does that, because when you were talking about it, I think, yeah, that's fabulous, brilliant idea, but how does that fit in, how would you see that fitting in with other services in the future in terms of, and what I'm concerned about is competing people trying to support other people. So where I live, for example, we have a care navigator and a nurse, and we have a doctor, and we have and the local church. So where would a peer navigator fit in with all these other different service people who are trying to help?
That's a really good question, thank you, Sarah. So we're really at the beginning of thinking through how the peer navigator service will work. And as part of that, we've started having conversations, but I'd be really interested to have a conversation with you about that, if you're happy to do so. Our vision for the peer navigators isn't that it replaces local support. It's that the people that would call our information line anyway, and hopefully that we'd extend the reach and reach different people through our information line, but they would call, some people prefer talking by phone because it's that little bit removed, so they feel they're able to share things that they might not be able to face. But as the service develops, ideally we'd want to be able to link people into local support. That's obviously going to take a huge amount of effort and probably a significant amount of time to develop, but that's our kind of long-term vision, so that it's much more around thinking through the kinds of questions people might want to ask and the emotional support as a touch point for people, but not in any way to replace local support, much more to act as a further signposting connector into what's already available.
And I think many people in the room will have had the experience that whilst there are some people who are very well supported with local connections, there are many, many people who report not having any of this kind of support at all. So a respected source that can begin to deliver that and then network into local sources seems to me a really important first step. I'm looking at my watch. No, did you have something burning you wanted to say, Zach? Did I see you? No, it was just a twitch. The next bit, thank you to Dave and to Nat, is we're going to have a panel discussion. So I'd like to invite Mark Jarman-Howe and the panellists to come up. Mark is the Chief Executive at St. I don't know whether it's Helena or Helena. Helena at St. Helena. So Mark, I'm going to leave it to you now.
Okay, good afternoon everybody. Panelists would like to come and join me. What we're going to do is hear from our esteemed colleagues who are going to give us some different perspectives, different reflections on what we've heard so far. And then I'm going to open this up for some discussion. I'm going to ask my colleagues on the panel to try and keep their comments to about 5 minutes, so we've got plenty of time to bring other people in the room into the conversation. We've got Fiona McKenzie and Simon Chapman here with us. I'm hoping we've also got...
They're just getting mic'd up.
Oh, they're just getting mic'd up. Excellent. So while Darrell Lung is getting mic'd up, and Ivor Williams, are you here as well? Excellent. Hi, Ivor. We'll make a start, and perhaps if I could ask you, Simon, to kick off with your thoughts.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks very much for asking me. How's the sound working? Can you hear me at the back right? Yeah. I'll give you a chance to test it beforehand, which is worth asking. So thank you very much for asking me here. And first, just congratulations actually to Compassion Dying on two really excellent publications. But also somebody who worked in the voluntary sector for a long time in a relatively small charity as well, that aspired, like Compassion Dying does, to, if you like, punch hard above its weight in terms of staff and capacity. I think you've taken a really brave but right forward-thinking decision in relation to the open sourcing. I hadn't heard about it before today, and this is me speaking as myself rather than on behalf of any organisation. But good luck with that and all power to you. And I hope that has the impact that you look for, and also that funders respond appropriately to that as well. Because I think it's brave but right as well. So having worked in the palliative and end-of-life care world for quite a long time, I moved over to NHS England earlier this year. And I think the brief I've been asked to give is actually sort of how is the system now responding, and what are we thinking about in relation to personalised care. And I sit in something called the Personalised Care Group in NHS England, which is probably a good indicator that at least quite a lot of work is going on in relation to that. And that group was formed last summer out of a number of different teams that were brought together into one place, really to try and create a coherent narrative about what personalised care is and what changes need to happen within the health and care system in order to make that happen. Our vision is twofold, really. One is it is about giving people greater choice, control over their own care and their support. But then linked to that, making sure that the changes that need to happen in the system do happen, that they happen on a sustainable, not a piecemeal basis. In the end, the personalised care becomes business as usual for the NHS. A lot of us in this room have been lobbying, advocating for person-centred care for quite a long time. It hasn't happened. It feels, and I've put a blog up on the NHS England website about this shortly after joining, it feels that we are reaching that tipping point now, and there is, if not now, when? And this is our moment, and we are hopeful that the long-term plan, when it comes to the NHS, which is something that we have to produce in response to the funding that the government announced earlier in the year, will have personalised care absolutely at the front of that. So what does that look like? What do I wish I'd known in relation to end-of-life care in relation to that? It's really important. We hear from people all the time about that need for honest conversations. That needs to start with a recognition that somebody is reaching the end of life. And so identification is a core part of what my colleagues in the end-of-life care team are now asking the system to do in terms of really ramp up efforts to identify people approaching the end of life and start to have those conversations with them. Advanced care planning, personalised care and support plans. And then make sure that those are recorded and shared across localities. There's no point having a plan and putting it in a drawer. That's why it's really great to see people like Julia Riley here, the work that she's doing with Coordinate My Care and other similar electronic systems around the country are going to be really important in making sure that people's wishes are shared and understood. And as part of that conversation, we know that there are things around the Mental Capacity Act, tools that can be used there. And again, Compassion in Dying has done great work into talking about what advanced decisions to refuse treatment might look like and other things as well. But it is broader than that. So it was interesting to see in the publication people talking about we didn't know what our treatment options are. Actually, there's an assumption there that the right option is treatment. So we can challenge that. Also, you heard the word about community in relation to that. So a key part of the comprehensive model for personalised care that we have built as part of our narrative into the system for this is connecting people to communities through, for example, social prescribing. Linked on to that, other tools available, personal health budgets in relation to that. So NHS England has written to all local systems saying we expect that by April 2019, so the end of this year, that for people living at home in receipt of community health care, a personal budget is the default option. That's a significant impact for people at the end of life. What does that mean? It means that you have greater choice and control over the funding package that is available for your care. Is used and how it's deployed, and that's been trialled, tested in various areas. Good experience in Warrington, indicative only, not published in relation to this, so let me caveat that in that way. And again, taking on board all that Barbara was saying about the weakness of place of death as a measure, but it's an indicative proxy. It's the one that we've got at the moment. But 83% of people on a personal health budget in Warrington died at home compared to 26% of people otherwise in relation to that. They found that it was significantly cheaper a week on a personal health budget. A week on a personal health budget. I got this the right way around. My brain's fading on a Friday. Was about 6 times less than a week of the traditional offer. But I think really importantly for providers and commissioners, nobody in receipt of the personal health budget used the funds that they had to pay for the traditional offer. They were using it to try and buy in other things. I think Barbara mentioned, or somebody mentioned sort of emotional support, and actually talking therapy was quite high up people's lists in relation to that. So we are finding that when you give people choice and control, they use it effectively, they use it for outcomes that suit them, and actually they probably use it in sort of financially more effective way too. So this is the sort of thing that we need to see more of. This is what we are, as I say, optimistic that NHS England was saying a lot about in its long-term plan, but I can't say any more than that about it at the moment. So happy to talk more later.
Thank you very much, Simon. We'll hear from each of our speakers and then we'll open it up for questions. So perhaps, Fiona, if I can invite you to speak next.
Yeah, sure. Hi everyone, my name's Fiona. On my phone, the very phone that's in front of me actually, is an unfinished playlist that is entitled When I Die. I have absolutely no intention of dying anytime soon, but it does matter to me. Music matters to me, and I think it's really important to be prepared. So I'm here, I guess, to provide some of my personal reflections on the things that matter most in care and in life as we think about life and death as experiences. I am someone who lives with 3 long-term conditions, one of which is fairly life-changing, and I promised I'm not going to cry. I use humour quite a lot to lighten the mood when I'm anxious, so please laugh along to cheer me up. And I should start by saying, for all those friends and family that are watching on Twitter, because obviously you all are, that I am not dying. This is not an announcement. I'm sorry all to have frightened you. I am, however, facing a decision and surgery that will change my expectations of life and potentially have an impact on my mortality. And that is quite a place to be in at the tender age of 34. Right, death is all around us. It's part of the lives that we live, and I loved to hear the Minister of Religion at the back. I'm the daughter-in-law of 2 vicars, and I'm very conscious of how much life and death is part of our everyday. I know plenty of people who have unfortunately passed away over the last 30 years of my life. And yet it's only in thinking about my own death that I start to grapple with what it is I would like it to look like. But more than that, more importantly, what do I want my life to look like before I reach those end stages? I grew up in New Zealand in the 90s, which was unfortunately one of those top teen suicide countries at the time. I think it was second to Finland, and I grew up in a town where a lot of teens killed themselves. They killed themselves for all sorts of awful and terrible reasons. But by the time I hit 20, I'd had more than 5 friends pass away. And death felt very much part of the life that I lived. And I guess part of my enthusiasm for talking about death, because I am unapologetically passionate about talking about how we live our lives and how they end, is that I felt like I grew up in a culture where that was a little bit more allowed and encouraged, although that had downsides. I guess the other thing to say as background is that I come from a medical family, for better or worse. I have ended up in healthcare, but my father, who I'm going to end with some advice from, but was initially, for early in his career, was an intensive care consultant, and is now working at the other end of life. He helps mums have babies. He's an anaesthetist. And my grandfather was an orthopaedic surgeon. My grandmother was a public health nurse, and the other grandmother was just a nurse on a ward for a long time. Just a nurse on a ward, a very important nurse on a ward. So all of my background comes with all of that a little bit. But I'm going to reflect on, I guess, the social and emotional issues that come with life and death. And there are 2 things I want to talk about. And all of it comes, I guess, of that sense of, I think Natalie talked about the gulf of the unknown. The sense of having to work out how you're going to make a decision in life. I have been incredibly lucky, in some respects, to grow up in a family that loves to talk about death and dying. We talk about it over Christmas dinner. Why not? My grandparents started this, and it's fair to say it happens more on the Mackenzie side than on my mum's, the Davis side, but nevertheless, how we want to live and how we want to die has been very much part of the family conversations. And that has allowed for a much more, I guess, nuanced understanding of what I think death looks like, of what the end stages of life look like. But also, I'm much more aware of what my family wants and how they want to die. That doesn't make it any easier on me. My grandfather passed away, this will make me cry. My grandfather passed away 4 years ago, and he passed away because he refused treatment. And he refused treatment for all of the right reasons for him. He was going to be stuck at home in a bed on an oxygen tank. And he was a vibrant person who wanted to live and be out of bed. And he talked in his final days about maybe taking up painting again, which I know he loved, but was only something he did when he was depressed. It wasn't a life he wanted to live, and so he chose to refuse treatment. It was a really hard time for the family, but it was really important because we'd had continuing conversations over all of my life about this being what he and my grandma wanted in terms of how they moved from life to death, and so in some respects I think we found it easier. It wasn't easy in any respect, but it was easier because we had had continual family conversations. My grandfather wrote his own eulogy, as it turned out, and it was quite a thing to behold. He took the advantage to preach on every point he wanted to make, and used my uncle, who was something of a comedian, to give it. And it had everyone in stitches, but it was one of those moments where I was really proud of that family, proud to have come from a family that thought about how they wanted to be thought of after death. And my mother, I guess, my mum is the one other person in the family I want to talk about. She has made an advance decision, which I hold, and we all hold a copy of in our houses. And she has taken this to the extent she is very keen not to get treatment should she find herself needing the kind of treatment that will either prolong an awful life or lead to her not having any quality of life. And so she has no CPR tattooed on her wrists. This is not how to get an advanced decision, but is, I guess, a good way of reminding all of us about her wishes and our common understanding, I guess, of what she wants. It's very hard to avoid no CPR on her wrists when I give her a hug. And yeah, I hope we never need them, but they're there and they have allowed us to have conversations. So the second thing I want to talk about just briefly is about a really good interaction I had recently with a clinician, and I have found myself back in secondary care needing their help and support and thinking about more permanent and radical forms of treatment, having exhausted most of the medical options, most of the kind of social options, and many surgical options. I've had 5 rounds of surgery for this particular condition. And we're at a point where a large chunk of me we are talking about removing a large chunk of me in an effort to make my life better. And so I went along and I had a lovely conversation with my CNS, my clinical nurse specialist, and we talked about all of the things that they might be able to do and all of the things they couldn't do, and then made an appointment to see the surgeon. And I went along to see the surgeon, and I guess 2 things happened that I was frustrated and surprised by. Frustrated I'll start with because the rest of it is a pretty good story. The frustration was the things on offer were nothing that we talked about with the CNS. So the information was different from one person in a room to the second person in a room. And actually we had been told categorically that one thing was not a treatment option, when in fact that treatment option is what we're going to go for. We were told it wasn't done. So these kinds of this shouldn't be happening. We should not be communicating in this way in our health service. So let me talk about the good. We walked into this conversation with a surgeon fully knowing what we were deciding, or at least thinking that. And his opening question was, so we said we'd come to sign on for surgery. He said, what kind of surgery do you think you are having? And I had that moment of, why are you asking me? I'm not the surgeon. What he meant was, what is it that you are looking for? And in fact, that's what he asked for next. We had a very nuanced conversation over the following hour and a half about what it was that I was looking for from treatment. What it was that I wanted my life to look like, not just in the next year, but in the next 10 years, 15 years, and potentially for the rest of my life. We talked about my goals and aspirations. We talked about what I want from my career and life. And it was in those moments that I started to understand some of the other options that were available to me, and he talked us through those. What made it particularly a good interaction was it felt like power was shared, like he heard and understood what mattered most to me. But that wasn't a what matters most to you question. It was a real sense of what is it you want to do with your life. You clearly want more than spending lots of time in the basement of the hospital just down the road. Where would you like to be and go in 10 years? Tell us about it. And I've never had that from a surgeon before. I'm not sure I've ever had it from a consultant before, if I'm honest, and I spend quite a lot of time with them. We got given so much useful information, not in written form, but with the potential to have it in written form if we wanted it. But after the hour and a half and having exhausted as many questions as we could think of, we were given the time and space to think about what we wanted to do, to make the decision in whatever way we wanted to make it. We were given phone numbers to call and places to look for information when required. Most importantly, he addressed and engaged with my husband, who is, he won't like being referred to as this, or he might do. He's going to be on Twitter, which will frustrate me. But anyway, so in lots of ways, he is my carer. He takes care of me on the days when I'm not well enough to get out of bed, and a lot of the time he takes care of me on the days when I am vaguely well enough to get out of bed, but choose not to. And he is the person who logs all of the information that we hear in our appointments. I found out early that I couldn't take it all in, but he sits there happily on his phone, taking down everything that we possibly need. I know I need to wrap up, and I will do, but it was the way that the surgeon engaged with him in this process, as if, and he is, as important in it as I am. That sense of understanding not just what matters most to me, but what matters to him, and if we really grappled with what this looks like for our lives together, because we come, in some respects, as a unit. So, I'm going to sum up. Thank you. There were 3 things that are in the report that I think I've talked about vaguely and with very reflective way that I think are really important. What matters most is crucial. Priorities do differ. I'm choosing an option that's going to potentially give me a shorter life, although we still don't fully understand the evidence behind that. But it has the highest potential for a better quality of life, and that's what I want. So I'm taking a huge risk, but I'm taking that risk on a better quality of life for shorter term. That's not what everyone would choose. The next thing is about that honest information and communication. The best interactions I have are where someone is willing to be honest with me, where they lay out the options and choices and don't fill it with language that I struggle to understand. I am a bright and intelligent young woman, but I sit in a consultation and I find myself lost. It's so easy to pretend and forget that the people in front of us don't live with these terms and this language on an everyday basis. Keep it simple. And the last thing, and this loops back to my beautiful family, is to talk about it. There is a perpetual cycle of non-discussion. I think it's written in the report around death and dying. One of the best things that we can all individually do is choose to talk to our family and friends about it. We need support to plan, and that's why I believe so firmly in what Compassion in Dying are doing. And we need to continue to have discussions about advanced decisions. I think it's really important, though, that advanced decisions aren't just something that someone chooses without the family discussion that goes around it. It's so important that families, no matter how nervous and concerned they are, have a conversation around it, because it becomes a lot harder in that moment for people. My aunts found it really difficult to deal with my grandfather's choices. And I can completely understand that, but because we never had an option to not discuss it, it made things a little bit easier. If we'd had less time to talk about it, less opportunity, it would have been a lot more challenging. And so the last thing, and this is going to make you all cry, is some advice from my father, who, as I mentioned, is an anaesthetist. And recently his good, an old friend of his, a long-term friend and colleague, died very suddenly up a mountain. The friend, was a brilliant and compassionate intensive care consultant, and I knew him when I was a child. I texted my dad, and Dad gave me some advice that I'm going to pass on. Intensive care teaches you that this is how life is. There are no guarantees of tomorrow for anyone, not even intensive care staff. Make peace with your own mortality. Keep short accounts with God. Hug the people you love often, and live your life to the full.
I'm sure everybody agrees with me that we're all very grateful that you got out of bed this morning. Because it's lovely to hear someone speak so bravely and openly about their personal experience. And I think when you play the personal experience card, you get an extra 5 minutes. I'm sure Ivor and Daryl will be happy to stick within their 5 minutes so that we can keep some time for questions. Perhaps Ivor, you'd like to go next? Thank you.
Thank you. I was just thinking back, like, so many stories, and I think that's kind of part of this thing for me is one of the takeaways I took was this idea that we need space for discussions, and we need space for reflection and to make sense of stuff. And I think it's because as people we make sense of things through stories. Like the amount of stories you just told us which talk about that kind of richness of either living with something or your own experiences that you don't get from data, you don't get from forums, you don't get from all this kind of stuff, and that I think is really, really important. I was just thinking, my father-in-law's Italian, and he was a couple of weeks ago, and this is almost like an advanced care plan. He was like, there's 3 things I care about: food, drink. I was like, your daughter? He's like, well, yeah, of course. It's like that's his advanced care plan as far as I know. For those who don't know who I am, or the Helix is, we're an innovation studio. We practice human-centered design, and we're based out of St Mary's Hospital. And we're part of Imperial College London. So we've been working with Compassion Dying on different sorts of projects. We've been looking at advanced care plans ourselves in terms of how that really is being defined for the sort of digital age. But we've worked with the Resuscitation Council. We helped develop and co-develop the RESPECT planning process. We also work with hospices quite a lot. We're doing projects in adult hospice care and children's hospice care. So this is kind of, any of my reflections are very much that of a designer, also just as a person rather than a clinician. So I think there's a couple of points is really around this idea that I think what I took from the report is this need and expectation for personalization, for lack of a sort of better word, and the sort of vital importance for responsiveness in planning, but in end-of-life care in general. But underwritten by all this is the need for culture change. And the way I kind of took the issue of culture change was, the Portuguese kind of communities talking about, we don't use the word death. And I kind of recall, I was like, yeah, that's true, but I did a foundational course in palliative care at a hospice, and we did some role playing, and the guy was like, okay, we're going to do some role playing, we're going to want you to kind of break the bad news and have a difficult conversation, which I agree is kind of a bit of an odd one. But these very well-meaning, kind of very experienced nurses doing role playing with each other in a very safe environment still couldn't say death, and the guy's like, you're gonna have to say it, and they're like, I just couldn't do it, like, I don't want to be really harsh. He's like, no, the whole point of you being here is you have to say it. And it was just like, oh my God, they were really struggling, because it just, from my experience and our experience as a team, the sort of expectation of being in a hospital, being under care, is that you will get better, and depending on how your entry point into the sort of the end phase of your life is either under the sort of warm embrace of a hospice, or it's in the sort of the rushed place of an acute ward, or the emergency department. And so that kind of the variety of even how professionals have barriers in themselves to deal with, I think is really important. And so the kind of takeaways from me were really about one thing that kind of has occurred to me and kind of come up in conversation a lot is this idea of how we can train and support people, admittedly, to have the conversations in ourselves. But for those who are looking after people, I'm basically kind of pointing to care homes and kind of wondering, like, how can the sort of practices of, you know, good conversations and planning and discussions early on happen where more people are dying, and that's in care homes. And I think that's kind of, you know, thinking about how we can broaden the reach to sort of capture more people and to get, you know, people engaged in this kind of space. I think that's a really kind of, it's a bit of a blank spot. So I'm hoping that can be maybe a point of discussion. And to that extent, I think planning and end-of-life discussions can be fairly kind of deprofessionalized. I think most of the discussions aren't really clinical for a lot of it, because it is really about what really matters to people. I also have a playlist with my favorite music on it. That's the only thing I've planned, and I've like been immersed in this for years. It's like I'll be gone. It doesn't matter. You know? So I think that technology can help personalize the experience, but I think from our experience at the Helix is that the systems need to work together, which is a Herculean pushing a rock up a mountain sort of problem, and I don't know who can really respond to that. I'm kind of curious as to NHS Digital is developing the sort of the care record, and tacked onto the end of that, I know Jeremy Hunt put end-of-life care preferences. I don't know if that's actually going to be developed and put across to the majority of people when that gets released, whenever it is next year. And I guess the sort of last kind of queries were, I kind of thought, you know, before Natalie showed the sort of prototype, I was like, yes, shared experiences are really good. Like, yes, questions are really good to get started. Like, you know, simplicity always a winner. And I was thinking, probably isn't enough. I'm sure you probably need to just speak to someone, and sure enough, you know, you guys have done that. And I'm like, that for me is one of the largest gaps, is how people can just speak to other people. And I think that the largest thing I took away from this report is actually, it's permission. I speak as a designer. It's permission for us who aren't clinicians who work in this space to be a little bit bolder, because I think it's like there's a consensus that there's just not enough happening. And first of all, be safe. Second of all, be appropriate, but actually be a bit bold. That actually people have got so many stories they want to share, and I think it doesn't have to come from the healthcare professionals. I think there's a whole thing about, I've got a bit of a bugbear that death and dying is still a clinical thing. It's like, can we just get it out to other places and actually kind of let the conversation just swirl around for a while, because I don't think harm will come of it. And more of all, actually, people will actually start to become engaged into it in a way which makes sense to them, which is you can't design for, you can't really create policy for, you can't really do, you can't force people into that hole. So I think my main takeaway is to be a little bit bolder. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Ida. And last but certainly not least, Darryl.
Right, well, thank you for asking me to speak. I hope you can hear me. Yes? I'm a geriatrician, and I've spent 20 years at the same hospital, and I've been in the NHS for 30 years. The commonest cause of death on certificates today is dementia. The life expectancy from being diagnosed is possibly 7 to 10 years if it was Alzheimer's disease. Can be a lot longer if you include cognitive impairment. I spend much of my day and night trying to really work out whether someone is getting better slowly or dying slowly. And it's not that straightforward. And how many courses of antibiotics is not enough, and how many courses of antibiotics is too many. Is that any better? So there's great difficulty in deciding when you want to try and help someone live well with their disease or help them die well because their condition has changed, particularly with the non-cancerous conditions. We see 90-year-olds from nursing homes in 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times who continue to get better with antibiotics from aspiration pneumonia. perhaps you may consider their quality of life is poor, but it is still life, and they are still someone's grandma. So it is very, very difficult. I think what we need to do in conjunction with this drive, which I completely and fully support, is also discuss more about what I would call ceiling of treatment and ceiling of care. And the focus that I have tried to give, particularly in the last decade with dementia care, I've learned and become used to understand and now feel like I know what family and person-centred care is, and particularly person-led care. But equally, you can only lead your own care, you can only be at the centre of your care if you are given the right information, the right advice at the right time. If it's done well, it's an amazingly, fantastically rewarding profession. I've gained so much joy through my career by doing it. But it does come with a huge burden if you do it well. I've done 30 years in the NHS, 30 years at the coalface. Every single day of my working career, I've looked after people who are dying. I'm going to tell you this now. This is my bit of personal information. For the past 2 months, I've had the first ever sick note in my whole career because it's just getting a bit too much.
Thank you. That's that's amazing for you to share your experiences. And 30 years is certainly a lot longer than a life sentence, which may or may not be an appropriate comparison to this conversation. We have got some time, which I think we really wanted to protect for some contributions from around the room. So can I ask if anyone would like to share some reflections on what they've heard or some questions for our panel? Who'd like to go first? All at the back there.
Hi, I'm Joan Reid from the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges. One of the comments that really struck me was around the very beginning is the start is a recognition, and it's a recognition around death and limits of treatment. And I work quite closely with all the Royal Colleges around choosing wisely, which is slightly different. But I think the themes are the same, and to be able to have that recognition and to be able to then start those conversations, the doctor, the clinician is absolutely crucial. If they don't recognise it, then there's no way the patients are. And one of the things that I'm really grappling with is around shared decision making generally, but also at end of life, is doctors are just inherently trained to extend life, to treat, to intervene, and it's so against what their being and their raison d'etre. So what do you think we can do? I think part of it is training, and we might have to go way back to medical schools, but how can we untrain what's been trained, and how can we change that culture? Because I think without it, it's really going to kind of strangle the conversation and what we can deliver in this agenda.
Thank you. I think that's a fantastic question. I think we have to lead by example. I think every single hour that we are delivering acute care, the most important thing is to really say, what would I do if this was my mum? What would I do if it was my grandma? Is it the right thing to start the 7th course of antibiotics in 7 weeks? Or is it better to be brave and to do the right thing, which is discuss with the person involved if they're well enough, or their next of kin, or power of attorney for health and welfare, and actually speak the truth, which often is, I think this lady's in the last chapter of her life. I don't know whether that chapter is 1 page or 30 pages, but we know that we need to think differently and we need to change the drive of care to quality, not quantity.
You just touched on something there that I think is really important, that sense of actually none of us know the outcomes that are going to how things are going to happen, how it's going to occur and play out. And there is a lot of uncertainty in healthcare, and yet clinicians, I think, often feel like they have to present like they either know all the answers or like they will have all the answers. And I don't expect you to have all of the answers. I just want you to say that I don't know how this is going to work out. I don't know whether it's going to be 1 page or 30 pages. Here's what we do know. Here's the evidence we do have. But that's the best I've got for you at this point. It's okay to say you don't know.
And I think that's something we have to teach
younger
trainees because I think they're pressurised to think that they need to know all the answers, and it's only through my experience that I'm brave enough to say, look, I just don't know.
As a manager that's worked in health service for a number of years, I know clinicians certainly don't have all the answers. It's usually the managers. Sorry, I think that wasn't the point that Fiona was making, so apologies. Have we got any other questions? Yeah, Sarah.
I'll just shout. I just want to make an observation, really, which is to say that there is light at the end of the tunnel. And I think there is some lightness in the darkness about people who don't, where the clinicians talk or not about talk. So I'm a carer for my 93-year-old mother who has Alzheimer's, lived with Alzheimer's for 9 years. And she's recently come out of hospital having had a hip replacement following a fall. At one point when she was in recovery, we decided to withhold and withdraw treatments because she wasn't responding to interventions. And I've written back to the GGH to say that the conversation from the anaesthetist and from the recovery team was the best palliative care and advanced care planning conversations I have ever had. And that what was really important, and this touches a little bit about what Barbara said earlier, was that home as a place doesn't need to be a physical setting. They made the place where we were feel home-like. Now, the fact that she woke up 12 hours later and asked for a cup of tea, and it has now back home with us, and we're now in we're actually, I think, on page 56 of the final chapter of her life, doesn't detract from the fact that these young people, who I'm afraid were at least 15 years younger than me, were not afraid to have a conversation about uncertainty. And we're not afraid to say, we don't know, but we think the what-ifs are this. What would you like to do as a family? So I kind of just want to say that there are people out there, and what my reflection is, it was their attitude that was important. And I think that we need to remember, and don't get me wrong, I've had terrible experiences as well, including a ward sister saying, there's that really pedantic daughter who keeps giving us details about her mother. It's like, she's not incontinent. But anyway, that's another point. But there are people there who are doing it well, and that's what we need. We need that honesty about the uncertainty, and that's just as important. So.
Thank you. Any other contributions? Oh yeah, just gentleman there.
Hi, I'm Richard Skiffer and I'm old and retired, but just to make a point about information and when we start giving it to people. Recently I had the privilege of speaking to some 15 and 16-year-olds about death and dying, and I was amazed at the response that I got and the questions that they asked. So I would make a plea for starting talking about death and dying much earlier than we do. Yes, it's people at my age who begin to think it's quite important to get this sorted out, but actually it might help with a lot of the problems we've heard about today if we, as a society, talked about it a little bit earlier.
Just jumping in on that again, I didn't think it was strange for my family to talk about death over Christmas dinner. It was only in conversation with other people that I realised that this wasn't what everybody did. I had no reason to expect anything else, and so there is something about this. How do we start to bed it in at a much younger age before people are, because it is just part of life.
We've had quite a lot of comments and sort of questions and sort of reflections from the panel here that sort of around the issue of sort of getting to grips with what the individual wants. But a lot of us here are from organisations that are trying to sort of make sure that the framework, the support is in place to sort of help that to happen. I'll put you a little bit on the spot, Simon, just perhaps others might want to come in as well, is what sort of indicators of success could we be looking at collectively to give us a sense that we're doing better individually?
Yeah, you have to completely put me on the spot there. That's quite interesting. So I'm fairly prone to thinking aloud, and I'll again dissociate myself from any organisation that I've ever been associated with, and just think aloud for a while in relation to that. But so what are the sort of things that we should be looking for? And I think my reflection would be that this is absolutely societal, as we've been hearing. I think that bit about being comfortable with uncertainty is really important. If I had a fiver for every time I've been to a meeting and somebody stood up as if they'd had this great new insight and said, in introducing, I don't know anybody in this room, but I do know we've got one thing in common, we're all going to die, as if that was some great insight into the human condition, I wouldn't be here, but I would be sunning myself somewhere hot and expensive at the moment. And there is that sort of, for those of us who work and have worked in and around end-of-life care, we sometimes feel a degree of frustration that the penny is taking such a long time to drop. But I think to pick up on Sarah's comment, there are good signs on it. I mean, for example, Atul Gawande's book, absolutely fantastic. I had some sympathy for the palliative medicine colleague who commented, famous doctor discovers dying, as well in relation to it. Great insights, but why is this not shown? What is it about death that we have somehow locked away, and how bold do we need to be? I mean, in my reflection, listening to, we've heard about Portuguese communities a couple of times today, is, of course we want to be culturally appropriate and culturally competent, but actually, at what point do we need to challenge cultures as well? In relation, at what point do we need to actually, of course that's how it is, but it's not helpful. Actually, do we want to unpick what that means, what the impact within a particular group is on the people who have to live within that? And we're not afraid to do that about other things, and but there is perhaps a sensitivity around dying still. Training would be another indicator in relation to this. Back to the question at the beginning, making sure that you've got more than about 5 minutes in the 6-year medical curriculum on palliative and end-of-life care would be a really important start in relation to that. As well. I think there's the sorts of things that we need to start looking for. When we've got more people dying at home, but a better understanding of what the quality of care is, that we, when we've found a way to actually record the sorts of conversations that we need to have with people, glean what was important to them, and make sure that what's important to them happened, and find some way of knowing that we've done that. Those are the sorts of indicators that we need to be looking for in relation to that. In multidisciplinary team meetings, how often are we reflecting on things that went well, which was great, or how often are things that went badly? Is there a shift in the sorts of discussions that we're having? Are problems that we identified and talked about 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 3 years ago still with us, or have we managed to shift those along to be met with another set of problems, because there will always be problems in relation to this? Or is it still somebody who dipped out of palliative and end-of-life care 10 years ago or 15 years ago and came back, would we be talking about the same things we were talking about then? Or have we moved on? I think let's think about it in those terms.
I think that's a very admirable response to being put on the spot, and I'm sure your organisations you carefully disassociated yourself from would be proud of that. I'll just take one last very quick comment from the back there from Jonathan, and then I'm just mindful of time and the drinks that are waiting for everybody.
Yeah, I really appreciated some of the discussion we've had, and it made me think that maybe what we've talked about, the fear of death or failure to confront it, is actually reflective of a much deeper trend that's going on, which is to do with the fact that people no longer believe in an afterlife, and therefore it means that this life, for a lot of people, is the only one, and therefore ending it is seen as a sense of failure or defeat. And therefore maybe part of the work that goes into what we're doing at CID is actually appreciating the life that's being lived and that's sort of coming to an end, giving people a sense of the legacy they're leaving behind, whatever that may be, and also maybe giving them a sense of a life fulfilled, and that if they find that they've done well and they've fulfilled their life, then they're more relaxed about letting go, and that maybe that's part of it also.
Yeah, thank you. Any final comments from our panel? No?
I'd just say that switch. You're absolutely right, Jonathan. From, if you like, being constantly focused on the curative rather than care, constantly focused on length of years rather than quality of life is really, really important. And we say it often in our group, but it's flipping the question around from what's the matter with you to what matters to you, which sounds a bit simplistic, but actually it carries some of the essence of what you're talking about.
I've got too much respect for Barbara not to let her have the last word, so...
As you get older, you have to rely on that kind of respect. It's very sad. I was just thinking in relation to your question, I'd be very... Given that we know that when people create advanced decisions and when there are good powers of attorney, we know that people get closer to choices and that their families feel more comfortable because there's lots of evidence about that. As a simple marker of progress, I would be very happy to see more people making advanced decisions and more people having competent powers of attorney. Let's just get there.
Very good point, yeah. So I need to bring things to a close now, but I prefer not to think of this as an ending and more as the beginning of the drinks reception. I'm hoping that people will stay and continue the conversation. I'm hoping our panellists are not going to be rushing off. So please take the time to have a chat with them and various colleagues here from Compassion in Dying. Please do take the opportunity before you go to have a look at the mock-up of the new website as well, which I think is very exciting. I'd like to thank you very much to all of our panellists and thank everybody here today for coming as well. Thank you.